The best game sessions in RPGs come from when the players are faced with a strong conflict. It could be something as simple as a villain with hostages, or it could be as complex as a guild staging a multi-point coup in a single night. You don't have to overthink your conflicts, but you do need conflicts to make your game interesting and drive it forward. It can feel daunting to try to come up with a lot of different interesting schemes that your NPCs and factions might be up to. Yes, it helps for your NPCs and factions to have goals and motivations, things that they're striving towards, things that are in opposition to your players. Those serve as launching pads for the game and can really get you started as you work your way into a new campaign or a new point in your campaign. But what I've come to realize is that in most cases, you don't even have to generate a lot of conflicts out of thin air. Once your game is underway, you can outsource most of your conflict generation to your players. Hi, welcome back aboard the Earthmote. I'm Randall, and today we're talking about managing the consequences of D&D parties' actions and how to use that to sustain your games going forward. I've come to rely heavily on the ICI framework for running my campaigns. If you're not familiar with it, the ICI framework was codified by Chris McDowell of Bastionland fame. The framework stands for information, choice, and impact. According to Chris, your prep work is to create these interesting choices for your players. And we achieve this through three main steps. The first is information. We need to give the players enough information to make informed choices. If they lack enough information, then there is no real choice. They'll likely be constrained to one or two of the most obvious answers that they would have in the situation. So as we run our games at the table, we need to be honest and open about the situations the players find themselves in. That way they can make informed choices about what they find most suitable for the current game context. The second element is choice. Ultimately, the players are responsible for their choice of action, but we as the game masters need to present interesting scenarios that offer multiple choices to the players. Ideally, situations with no clear, obvious best choice. That way, it's on the players to decide which way they would like to go. The third element is the impact. The players' choices are meaningless if there's no impact from them. As a game master, you need to consider their choices and then decide on what the impacts of those decisions are. Today, we're largely going to be focused on the choice and impact component of the ICI framework. The information component is critical as well. I've done another video on the ICI framework where I focus much more on the information part and the impact part somewhat. You can check out that video on the screen now if you'd like to. When thinking about the choices and impacts the players have on your campaign, I like to think about it in terms of an analogy. I heard this analogy somewhere else in context RPG games, but I don't exactly remember from who, so I apologize for that. But they essentially described it as a pool table or a game of billiards to think about it. Your players are the billiards player. They control the cue and drive their actions forward. As the players take their shots, which are their actions to complete their goals in the game, that can be represented by the cue ball striking into the numbered game balls on the table. Essentially, they are smashing into different elements in your campaign, which can be your NPCs and your factions, all based off of their own choices. With skill and luck, they're able to knock their objective off the board, or in this case, our pool table. But sometimes they might misstrike, or sometimes their actions have other ramifications. While they may knock one ball off the table into the corner pocket, perhaps they collide into another ball, or the ball they were trying to take out doesn't go into the pocket and instead crashes into a different ball on the table, or at the very least, ends up in a different position on the table. So the billiards analogy really helps me think about when the players take their actions, what is the impact on the board state of your campaign? I like to think about a few different questions here. How has the campaign changed after they've made their actions? How has their vantage point changed after they've made their actions? Does the player's actions cause different factions or elements in the campaign to collide with one another? Or does the party collide with a different faction as a result of their actions? And what are the consequences of that? So thinking about those things really helps me decide about what the impacts are of their choices, and that helps sustain the campaign going forward because I can present a new state, a new problem to them based off of their previous choices. If you're enjoying this video, you could lay down a perfect shot by hitting the like button and consider subscribing if you want to see more discussions and content like this in the future. Okay, let's take a look at an example to try and clarify how we use the choice impact component of the ICI framework to do most of the heavy lifting for our D&D campaigns. Let's say the players have defeated an evil baron that was ruling a land and making life miserable for his subjects. He was in the process of conjuring up a dark ritual to gain supernatural powers at the sacrifice of his peasants' souls. Dark stuff. But the players stopped him. They defeated him. The baron is gone. What are some potential consequences of removing the baron from the campaign? Here are a few that I thought of. The king will appoint someone new. Will they be any better than the old baron? What if the baron was using some foul artifact in the ritual? What happened to it? Do the players have it? What are they going to do with that artifact? What about the baron's plans? Maybe he was being aided by some lieutenants or a mage. Did any of them survive? Would they try to complete the ritual for themselves and gain that power for themselves? These are what I call first order impacts. They're pretty much direct consequences of the player's actions to defeat and stop the baron. But we can also have collateral or indirect impacts, things that are like second or third order impacts. Going back to our billiards example, let's say the players strike the cue ball into a pool ball, and that one deflects into another ball on the table. The players have impacted multiple elements on the campaign or the pool table, even though they've only made one direct strike. You could go beyond second or third order impacts if you want, but it's probably just starting to get convoluted at that point, and there's no real need to. Let's take a look at some examples of second or third order impacts in our Baron example. The Baron was cruel and draconian to his subjects, but his iron fist kept crime really low in the barony. With him gone, could there be an emergence of more brigands and thieves in the area? The peasants aren't subject to the baron's cruelty anymore, but are they any better off with thieves that are stealing and pillaging in their lands? Let's take a look at that foul artifact again. Maybe the barons stole it or borrowed it from someone else. They want it back. Does this now put the players or anyone they've given it to on a direct course with this entity? And thirdly, maybe the baron was interrupted before he could complete the ritual, but it partially succeeded. Does the dark force he was bargaining with for that power now have a small access way into these lands? Can it reach out to someone else? Maybe it can still enter the barony and cause problems for the players despite stopping the baron directly. You'll notice that all these impacts I've focused on are ones that drive the conflict and the complications in the game forward. These are the most important ones to think about because they'll be the ones that are most memorable to your players and also the ones that can sort of self-sustain the momentum in the campaign. But you can also have impacts that are positive or neutral for the players as well. I think these are important to include because they show your players that their actions do have positive outcomes on the world. It's not just complications and doom for them, which could start to feel depressing after a while. Maybe defeating the baron opens up a new trade route with a nearby fiefdom that the old baron was at odds with. The new trade will be good for the barony and the lives of the people in it will improve. But maybe for the players, that means they gain access to new equipment or materials that they couldn't before, all thanks to this trade route. By defeating the baron, maybe they were able to free his political opponents from his dungeon cells. These are good people that would seek to improve and make positive changes in the barony, and now they can do so now that they're not opposed or oppressed by the baron directly. So that's really it. Think about the player's actions from a standpoint of how they've changed the world around them. What are the direct consequences of their choices? Are there any indirect consequences of their choices? what outcomes promote conflict and complications for the players, and which outcomes are positive or neutral for the players that can be spotlighted so they can see the positive changes they're making in the world. If you're thinking about those questions, you'll have the player's history do a lot of the work for you as you're planning out the future events or situations that can come up in the campaign. This works both for sandbox and story arc games. In a story arc game, you'd use their choices to drive them down the narrative that you've outlined and you're working on. In a sandbox game, you would update the other factions and NPCs accordingly and have them start to enact their new plans or goals based on the changes that have occurred due to the Baron no longer being there. Then let those changes flow to your players through the information component of the ICI framework. You can do that by giving them new hooks, new rumors, or providing more information as they do their own exploration in your game world. Another way to think about driving conflict forward in your game is by remembering Newton's third law of motion. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. Our billiards analogy is a perfect example of Newton's third law. As the cue ball strikes into a billiard ball, the force is applied to that ball and it's propelled somewhere else on our table. When your players affect the game world, how does the world respond in turn? Now we can break from Newton's third law here if we so choose. Our reaction doesn't have to be equal to the players. I'm not even sure how you would determine equity in determining consequences of players' actions in an RPG in the first place, but game mastering is probably more of an art than a science anyway, after all, so I don't think it really matters. My point is that the reaction can be bigger or smaller or equal. Just use your judgment on what makes sense within your game fiction. You can follow the ICI framework to make your game self-sustaining for a long time, mostly. But I think at different points in our game, it's okay to let the consequences of the different threads finally drop out or fade away. There's no good rule of thumb here, but if your plan is to always make a more sinister or evil or more powerful threat behind the one the players just defeated, well, at some point that just starts to get old. It can raise the stakes in your game so high that it becomes hard to top. It's kind of like a superhero or a Dragon Ball Z problem. There's always a bigger villain for the players to deal with, and at what point is enough just enough? If you and your players like playing that way, that's totally fine. But if you're like me, you prefer to have a bit more grounded fantasy. Not every problem has to evolve into a world-ending threat. It's okay to let a conflict run its natural course and go on to the next one. If you're using the ICI framework, you can still devise that the closing of one thread can create problems or openings for others to emerge. Then that's great. But you'll probably have to do a little bit more legwork to get those new threads up and running again. But once your players decide to sort of bite on them and get involved and start taking actions, well, you're back on that self-propelled train again. You can just follow the ICI framework and rinse and repeat until you've decided that one is enough and go on to the next one. So that's it. Whether you're running a sandbox game or a story arc based game, you can use the ICI framework, look at the player's choices and the impacts of their choices to really self-propel your game. Let your players take the main actions in the campaign, and then you as the game master can react to their choices with sort of logical and plausible outcomes for those actions. Just remember to focus those outcomes on future complications or conflicts for the players, because conflict is what creates the tension, the drama, and the suspense that makes things interesting at the game table. When we look at our sessions retrospectively, we can see that the good story emerges from the play at the table. And it's satisfying because there was that conflict. The stakes were there. The players had to risk something in order to gain something. And that's what really makes it fun and exciting. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like. It really does help the video out a lot. Consider checking out my newsletter, Enchanted Nimbus, available on Substack. You can sign up to have it sent directly to your email. Thanks for watching. I'll see you back aboard the Earthmote again soon.